Hi there, welcome to Mentor Monday. I know it's Wednesday. On Monday, we asked, should you squeeze the glutes in back bends? Or if you're a teacher, should you cue squeeze the glutes in back bends? I've been thinking about this, and I assume that the cue comes from the desire to elicit hip extension because the glute causes hip extension. Glute activation helps with hip extension. So far so good. So if we say squeeze the glutes, somebody will contract their glutes and that will cause hip extension. Maybe. The glute is a muscle that starts kind of here, and if you look the way my fingers are going, that's the upper fibers of the glute, and then it kind of tapers down into the back of the femur. And these fibers down here at the lower part of your pelvis, along with your hamstrings, do indeed cause or elicit hip extension, along with other muscles, but let's just say that for now. So as I contract both the glute, the lower fibers, and the femur, what happens is I bring the femur closer to the pelvis and the bottom part of the pelvis closer to the femur. So I posteriorly pelvic tilt, which is exactly what causes hip extension. So far, so good. So when I have that posterior pelvic tilt, lower part of the pelvis down to the femur, femur up to the pelvis, I lengthen my low back muscles, and I think that's where people assume that the SI joint gets some kind of support by hip extension, which it does, but the way we get hip extension might have to change because the upper fibers of the glute perform a different action. The upper fibers of the glute perform hip extension. So in other words, when we contract the upper fibers of the glute, they externally rotate the femur, they spin the femur out in its ball and socket. So they perform external rotation. So when I squeeze my glutes, what I do is I pull my butt cheeks together, and there is absolutely no way for me that doesn't cause that external rotation. So let's try it. Come down to the ground. Bend your knees. Lift your knees off the floor, but keep your knees pulling together. So they're not joined together, but don't let them spin out. So as you press your pubic bone down, your lower pelvis comes towards the back of your femur comes towards your lower pelvis, and sure enough, you have hip extension. But if you squeeze your glutes together, you get external rotation of the femur. And the problem with that is that it's the upper part of the pelvis that gets pulled down. The upper part of the pelvis gets pulled down, the sacrum stays where it is, and it causes anterior pelvic tilt rather than posterior pelvic tilt, which brings lumbar extension into it and maybe a little bit of pinching on the SI. It is true that almost all yoga teachers in shoulder bridge will ask the students not to let the knees roll out, because when the femur is neutral and I draw the lower part of my pelvis to my femur towards my pelvis, I get this gorgeous hip extension and a posterior pelvic tilt. When I allow the upper fibers to get involved, actually, I end up with an anterior pelvic tilt, which we know from cueing shoulder bridge can cause a little bit of pinching in the SI. The other reason why maybe there's pinching in the SI as we let the femur spin out, so in other words, another reason why I don't particularly like the general cue, squeeze your glutes is that there's a fascial connection between one glute and your opposite latissimus dorsi, and it goes over both of your SI joints. So for some people, actually allowing the upper fibers to contract, in other words, squeeze your glutes, will cause a pinching in the opposite SI. So, squeeze the glutes to me means pull your butt cheeks together. Pull your butt cheeks together to me means upper fibers. Upper fibers causes anterior tilt, which is not what we were looking for. Remember, we wanted the low back to stay a little bit more lengthened. And also the crossing of the fascia, the myofascia at the back, might cause pinching on either same side or opposite side SI. Lastly, that is not true when the femur's fixed. So the only time you could really say squeeze the glutes is in something like camel, because no matter how hard they pull their butt cheeks together, the femur can't spin out because the femur is fixed on the floor via the knee. Lastly, although anatomically glute activation causes hip extension, we cannot divorce anatomy from the person who owns that anatomy. And there are many people who come into your classrooms that are already in hip extension. They are already in a posterior pelvic tilt. Their glutes are already firing too much. And you'll notice that they have a very flat low back, not me, them. So they're already in a posterior pelvic tilt. These are already turned on, and their lumbar erector spinae really aren't doing the job that they're supposed to do. So for those people who are already in extension, they don't need more extension. They certainly don't need to be cued, squeeze your glutes. In fact, they might need to be told, relax your glutes so that their lumbar extensors can do the job they're supposed to do. Do you use the cue squeeze your glutes? I'm not sure that it is doing the thing that you want it to do. A lot of people said it protects the SI. I think it's contrary.